The federal Liberals have reintroduced a bill that would scrap mandatory minimum sentencing for serious gun crimes, including robbery with a gun or even gun smuggling. To talk about this in a little more detail is our political reporter, Brian Lilley. Brian, how does this now mesh with the Liberals' get tough on gun crime claims?
Well, their claim that they're getting tough on gun crime has always been false because the only thing that they've tried to do is get tough on legal, licensed, RCMP vetted gun owners. They have not done anything to tackle the gun crime that plagues city streets, whether we're talking Lethbridge, Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, Surrey, Toronto, Ottawa. It goes right across the country. This is an issue, and it's an issue of smuggled illegal guns coming in from the United States being used by street gangs, by organized crime to settle scores, to protect drug stashes, to take out competition. That's what the problem is, and they haven't been focused on that. Now they've brought in Bill C5, which is a retread of Bill C22 that was introduced in the last parliament but not passed. And they say that this is a bill to take care of systemic discrimination against racial minorities, including Black and Indigenous communities across Canada. Okay, but how does that jive with the idea that if you are having a third conviction for possession of an illegal gun, knowing that your possession is unauthorized, that you shouldn't have a mandatory minimum? Look, if you ever wanted to know what it looked like to have an ideological activist academic in charge of the justice system, we now know because that's what David Lametti is, and that's what this bill is. uh, Possession of an illegal firearm has no mandatory minimum penalty, Hal, for the first offense. It only has a 1 year mandatory minimum if you're convicted a second time, and a 2 year less a day mandatory minimum if you're convicted a third time. And Lametti is out there saying, well, this is to protect people who make small mistakes in their lives. I'm sorry, once you are using guns in the commission of a crime multiple times, that's not a youthful mistake. You are a criminal that deserves to be dealt with harshly. And although the Supreme Court has struck down some mandatory minimums, they have upheld them in other cases. And this is a case of the government deciding that they will get rid of the ones that do not align with their soft on crime approach.
So instead of going after the legal gun owners, as we discussed, why the hesitation about going after more of the gangs, especially a lot of the illegal guns crossing the border from the United States into Canada? Go after the source.
Well, because they claim that too many visible minorities of different backgrounds are incarcerated in Canada, and that's due to racism. And therefore, we have to get rid of tough on crime measures. That does not work. I'm sorry, that simply does not work. Maybe in some cases, but we're talking about serious gun crime, robbery with a firearm, extortion with a firearm, possession of firearm, using it in the commission of a crime. You know, Pierre Trudeau was the first prime minister to bring in a mandatory minimum for gun sentences because of public outrage at guns being used in the commission of a crime. Now his son is doing away even with that, while his party makes it sound as if only conservatives ever brought in mandatory minimums. That's not the case. By the way, they're keeping them for a bunch of other serious offenses, but they're doing away with them on very serious gun crimes while claiming that they're looking after public safety. They're not. They're lying to the public and turning this into an ideological and political issue rather than a public safety one.
Brian, no decision has been made yet by the Trudeau Liberals on banning or allowing Huawei into Canada's 5G system. Now, you reported a little while ago that Canadian telecom companies had bought close to $1 billion in Huawei gear. Now those companies are asking for compensation if the company is in fact banned.
Yeah, so companies like TELUS and Bell are major investors in Huawei technology because the current rules still allow them to buy Huawei gear. And so a few years ago, between the two of them, and you add in smaller companies like Freedom when it was independent, or I guess Wind Mobile it was called back in the day, SaskTel, the provincial phone company in Saskatchewan, they all put in a lot of Huawei gear. It was about 300 billion a year for several years before sales started tapering off as the public was outraged at Huawei being part of our system. But Bell and TELUS and these other companies are saying to the government, look, if you ban them and tell us that we have to get rid of that gear, Well, then we want compensation because we bought the gear under existing rules. You never banned it. We invested under, what you said was legal. So if you're going to make us take it out, you have to pay for it. Now, if they ban Huawei from being part of future gear, then eventually that gear will all be replaced. It has a shelf life and it is regularly cycled in and out. So in about 4 to 5 years, there wouldn't really be any Huawei equipment left in the system. But right now, if you're on TELUS or Bell or SaskTel, you are using Huawei for a good chunk of your cell phone tower calls. And that is something that a lot of our security allies and our security agencies say we shouldn't really be doing, given their close ties to the Chinese government in Beijing and the ways that they will use domestic companies from China to spy on countries like Canada or our allies.
A number of Canadians believe we should engage in some sort of a boycott of the Olympics in Beijing, China, even if our athletes still go. Brian, what would that actually look like?
Yeah, a growing number of Canadians saying, okay, let's not go. About 20% say don't even let the athletes go. But of course, the last time we did that was 1980 with the Moscow Games to protest the USSR's invasion of Afghanistan. A lot of the viewers may not even remember that. They may not have been alive at the time. But there was the Western countries boycotting the Moscow Games in 1980. The Eastern Bloc boycotted the LA Games in 1984. Athletes were the ones who really lost out in that. And so there's been a sense of, okay, let's boycott in a different way. So a diplomatic boycott would say all the things that go around the Olympics. It's not just the athletes that go. Politicians go, from a country like Canada, the Governor General might go. David Johnson has gone in the past. So would that happen, or would we say, look, the athletes will go, they will compete, they've worked hard for this, let's not punish them, but we're not going to lend credence to Beijing. And when you look at the treatment of the two Michaels, the espionage, the threats against Hong Kong, Taiwan, the genocide against Uyghur Muslims, there are lots of reasons not to give China any credence. It is controversial, and it is definitely controversial within Canada's Chinese community. There's a split there, but this is something that is growing. If Canada does it alone, it won't have a big impact. The United States may be heading in that direction as well, and we'll see how it plays out over the next several weeks.
Brian, with concerns over the new Omicron COVID-19 variant, some regions of the country have actually been discussing another potential lockdown. According to a new report by the Canadian Medical Association, that would be disastrous.
Yeah, a majority of Canadians are willing to accept some sort of temporary lockdown, but the CMA said, "Hey, look, we studied what happened during previous lockdowns, and they looked at a variety of data across the country in some cases, or they look at specific provinces. For example, in Ontario, they looked at the opioid crisis. I'm sure the numbers would actually be higher in BC. I know Alberta is dealing with a serious opioid crisis, but just in Ontario, the average number of daily opioid deaths went from 10 per day to 17 in the first year of the lockdown to 20 in the early days of 2021 when we were in the post-Christmas lockdown. So, that's one element. 4,000 deaths were estimated to have occurred because of missed surgery. Now, that was just between August and December of 2020. That's over a short period of time. That's 4,000 excess deaths due to missed cancer treatments, missed surgeries. Then you think of the ones that may not kill you quickly, but do lead to a deterioration in your quality of life and in your health. If you need a knee operation, Hal, and you've had to put it off for a year, well, when you're not mobile, all your other health indicators go down as well. So, yeah, putting off that knee injury is not going to kill you right away, but it might contribute to your death down the road. That's a fallout of a COVID lockdown. So the CMA is warning that this is something that you should consider when looking at public health measures. There's a big rise in cases here in Eastern and Central Canada. I know that's being discussed. There are some public health officers calling for that, but so far, the central ones are saying, no, not yet. We've still got a high level of vaccination. We've got masking. We've got other things. We don't need to go into a lockdown yet. and I'm hoping that's the way it stays.
The Trudeau Liberals have instituted new measures to deal with Omicron at the border. Now, recent polling, Brian, shows that there's been support for that, but you say some cracks are also beginning to show. Can you explain?
Cracks in consistency. If you leave the country and come back in, you're supposed to use the ArriveCan app. But myself and others across the country and media have heard from people who say, "Look, I was at the border crossing, and the ArriveCan app wouldn't work, and I'm only supposed to have all my data uploaded into that." So, if I'm going to be traveling, yeah, make sure you use the ArriveCan app, because if you don't, you could end up in a quarantine hotel coming back into the country, and nobody wants that. But also have all of your documentation printed out, because it may not work. And so there have been examples raised in the House of Commons of people who had the ArriveCan app, had their documents in there, it would not work, and they were put into a quarantine hotel, even though they were triple vaccinated. There's got to be some common sense to this. Yes, we want travel restrictions and definite screening for people coming from outside of the country. But for Canadians returning with 3 vaccines after a short trip to the States and then saying you've got to go into a quarantine hotel, that makes no sense. The Americans, by the way, have instituted a requirement that Canadians must have a COVID-19 test. Now, it can just be an antigen test, but we've got to have a COVID-19 test within 24 hours of coming in and face an awful lot of screening. We're not putting that same measure in place for Americans coming into this country. In fact, Americans get less screening than other parts of the world do, even though they're having their own. So there's a lot of inconsistency when asked about it. Some very valid questions about how does this work when that doesn't. The government's answer is, we're following the science. They won't say what science. They won't explain why there's inconsistencies. All they will say is they're following the science and hope that the questions will go away and we'll stop talking about it.
The federal Tories have been blasting the Liberals on inflation, but Brian, many people would argue it's actually a global problem with the increase in food, gas, and rent, and that nothing really can be done, but the Bank of Canada may begin raising rates?
Yeah, the Bank of Canada raising rates and stopping printing so much money are both signs that they realize that expanding the money supply by 20% is a contributing factor. There may have been some need for at least some of that during the COVID economic crisis, but did they go too far? That's one of the arguments the Conservatives make. And also, the idea that the bank is going to raise interest rates to deal with inflation would tell you that there is inflation in this country and that it's not just a global problem. So the Liberals are trying to say that there's nothing they can do, while the central bank, which they do control in some respects, it is arm's length, it is independent, but there is a government mandate established for how the bank should operate. The bank is making moves that would indicate that the government knows, yes, inflation is a problem. So it's back and forth. Look, the Conservatives have found their stride in the House of Commons in holding the Liberals to account on this. The Liberals don't have a good answer because it goes well beyond just a COVID inflation. Look at the price of housing going up from, I think it was $450,000 was the average price of a single detached home across Canada when the Trudeau Liberals came in, and it's now about $720,000. So how can you say that that kind of rise is due to the economy reopening up after COVID or due to supply chains? No, that's a homegrown problem, and the government simply doesn't have answers. So far, they've tried to rely for the first week or so on just saying $10 a day childcare. That didn't work. Now they're trying to point to columns from friendly publications like the Toronto Star and just claim that the Conservatives don't know what they're talking about. Clearly, the questions from O'Toole, Pierre Poilievre, Michelle Rempel, and others are having an impact on the government.
We talk about over $700K for a home in Canada. I'd like to take Toronto and Vancouver out of the equation and see for the rest of Canada what the actual number is there. Brian, let's talk about what's happening with some of the smaller parties. The Green Party is looking for a new leader, and apparently they're in some financial trouble. And Maxime Bernier survived a leadership review with the People's Party of Canada.
Yeah, I don't think Bernier's leadership was ever really in question with the People's Party of Canada, but it is good that he had one. He founded the party, named himself leader, never had a leadership contest, never had a leadership review. This is the second election he's gone through, hasn't won a seat in either election. So there's bound to be some questions, but the party faithful seem happy with where he's going. Max is a good campaigner. If Max Bernier wants to uh, improve his party's lot in the next election, then he can't just be a one-trick pony as he was in this last campaign, talking about COVID and lockdowns, most of which are provincial matters, not federal. And two, he's got to professionalize his party, get rid of some of the kooks that show up and cause him bad names, throwing rocks at the prime minister when you're on the local party executive. That, I'm sorry, that's just not a good look for any party, and it's going to scare off voters. As far as the Green Party goes, stick a fork in it. It's done. It was a vanity project for Elizabeth May for a number of years. They elected the first Black Jewish woman as their leader and then showed their anti-Semitic roots. I don't care if this party ever resurrects again. They're talking about having to close their national headquarters and declare bankruptcy. I hope they do.
Political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.